For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Shannon de Rehove. I'm at the Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria to meet with Gareth Newham, who is discussing whether the rule of law applies to the political elites. South Africans are becoming increasingly concerned about corruption. How much does corruption cost the country each year, and what could this money be used for?
Well, indeed, South Africans are becoming far more concerned. We've seen this being reflected in various national surveys. For instance, in 2008, only 15% of South Africans said that corruption was a major national concern. As of last year, 29% said they thought that corruption was a major concern. So we see the public perception of corruption getting worse, increasing. And then that's been reflected in other surveys, such as the Transparency Anticorruption Index, which shows that in South Africa we've dropped 10 places in 2 years. So we were rated 54th out of 182 countries in 2011. We dropped to 64th out of the same number of countries in 2012. And our best rating in terms of whether we thought we had a problem with corruption was in 2007. We scored a 5.1 at that scale. So various indicators are showing that corruption is getting worse, and people are thinking corruption is getting worse in South Africa. Last year, Willie Hofmeyer, who is then the head of the Special Investigation Unit, gave a conservative estimate, which is used by Treasury to Parliament, saying that around 25 to 30 billion rand a year is being lost each year to corruption, with the connivance of politicians and senior government officials stealing money from the state. This is the equivalent to improving our education budget by 20%, our health budget by 25%, and increasing our entire criminal justice budget by 30% a year. So the money that is being stolen from the South African taxpayer, and from all South Africans in matter of fact, could be used to improve the numbers of schools, clinics, hospitals, police stations, pay better salaries to the police officers, teachers, nurses, and could have a huge impact on our service delivery. So corruption is really a serious problem facing South Africa.
The government has established an anti-corruption task team to coordinate the activities of various investigation agencies with the aim of convicting 100 individuals guilty of corruption by 2014. Do you think the task team will be effective?
Well, I think the people working on the task team are certainly taking their job seriously. We have engaged with some of them. They really want to try and tackle corruption, and I think one of the things they realized is that they are, up until now, until very recently, most of the anti-corruption activity that's taken place in South Africa has really targeted quite low-level officials. So we're talking about state employers at quite low ranks who are receiving, say for instance, social grants in addition to their salary, which is illegal. It's a form of corruption. And they've managed to identify, say, about 19,000 officials. What they haven't been able to do is get the people involved in grand corruption, the people who are stealing, as you say, 5 million or more. Or much more than that. And there's really been such a small handful of cases in the last 10 years of people who are really stealing large amounts being convicted or even being investigated. And that is largely because those people are connected usually to very powerful politicians in South Africa. And they can use that power to escape justice. So they've set this goal, and they're up to date. The last report we saw earlier this year was about 27 people have been identified and were being investigated. However, of course, we really want to see cases before the courts. It's one thing to investigate, but unless people are finding themselves in prison and there's a very real threat of them being punished, that they won't stop doing this, and there won't be any deterrence for others to keep on trying to do this.
Do you agree that politically connected individuals are being protected from criminal justice processes, ultimately proving that they are above the law?
Well, we see this all the time, starting with our president facing 783 criminal cases of fraud and corruption, racketeering, money laundering. A lot more evidence against him than his previous financial advisor, Shibir Sheikh, not being brought before the courts. Seemingly compromised decision being made by the then acting head of the National Prosecuting Authority, Mshe Mokotedi Mshe. That case is under review before the Supreme Court of Appeal. Recently we heard of the partner of our deputy president, Kgalema Motlanthe, involved in sanctions busting, selling helicopters to Iran and making a huge profit there. The deal didn't go through, but there was quite hard evidence that she was involved in meetings to try and arrange that. That did not go. There was no Hawks investigation, no criminal investigation to that. The Motlanthe, who's got a direct and vested interest, referred it himself to the public protector. Now, the public protector is not a criminal justice agency. She's there to make sure that the public money is being spent in accordance to what it's supposed to be spent, but she can't conduct the kinds of forensic criminal investigations needed to prove corruption. She can't subpoena cell phones. She's got no access to intelligence. She can't compel people to give her statements. And the best you can do, and we've seen this, is write a report that will usually say there is no evidence of corruption. Doesn't mean that there isn't, but she doesn't have the capacity to find that evidence. So it was a smart move in Motlanthe. There's no threat of his partner being hauled before the courts. A long investigation process will take place for them to eventually come forward and say there's probably a need for more investigation, or we couldn't find enough evidence one way or another. We see again with the National Minister of Police. He's directly implicated in benefiting illegally from the Secret Service account of the South African Police Service, money that is supposed to be spent on intelligence operations to tackle high levels of organised crime. Was meant to renovate his house, build a wall around his private residence in KwaZulu-Natal. The newspapers have actually got access to the various invoices. They know how much was spent, and all the signatures went off with Richard Mdluli. So clearly high levels of corruption there. What happens there? It doesn't go to the Hawks or an investigation agency that can really trace where there's corruption. It goes to the Auditor General. Auditor General is not a criminal justice agency. It will take many months to look at just whether the paperwork's in order. When it comes to the Secret Service account, there's different rules, so they don't have the same access to the kinds of documents and don't have to prove as much. So you'll probably find at the end of that there will be no evidence of corruption, but further investigation will be needed. We see Becky Cele and Gwena Kambinda repeatedly breaking the law, as found by the Public Protector, to make sure that one businessman got 2 huge contracts for police headquarters leasing deals, totaling 1.67 billion rand. That man alone was going to make a few hundred million rand pure profit over the next 10 years, because the inflated rentals were 3 times the actual going rate. Now, why would 2 individuals at the most senior levels of the government repeatedly break the law? While being warned they're breaking the law, they remove those officials that are warning them and continue to break the law, as found by the Public Protector's 2 reports. What happens to that? Nothing happens to Gwena Kambinda. She's still a Member of Parliament. No investigation into her whatsoever. Beketele, a board of inquiry into his fitness to hold office is established. Does it have any powers to investigate? No. It can't subpoena people, can't get hold of cell phone records, it can't get hold of financial statements. After a protracted period, it comes up with a report that doesn't differ much from the Public Protector report, simply saying further investigation is needed. So we see a pattern of the most powerfully connected people in the most higher echelons of government, repeatedly a lot of hard evidence coming out that they are breaking the law, that there's problems there, and no criminal justice sanction or investigation taking place. If that happens, you can't fight corruption. Then it means that criminals will go out of their way to make friends with those people and benefit those people because they know they'll be protected. And that's what the single biggest problem we have in South Africa is, that the rule of law is not applied equally to all people. If you steal a bicycle as a poor person, you steal a loaf of bread as somebody living in an informal settlement, and the police have evidence, you'll find yourself locked up. Steal hundreds of millions of rands of taxpayers' money, and you're powerfully connected, nothing will happen to you.
South Africa's Constitutional Court has ruled that the DPCI, known as the Hawks, must be independent of the SAPS and of political interference. How do you think such independence would be achieved, and do you think it will be achieved?
Well, the Constitutional Court ruled that the Hawks, in its current legislative framework that is governing the Hawks, wasn't allowing it to be sufficiently independent. That is because it had to report to the police chief, the head of the South African Police Service. That's a unit of the South African Police Service, who is a political appointment and continues to be so. The most recent commissioner is also a political appointment, no experience in policing, might have good management experience, good intentions, but if you don't understand the dynamics of the South African Police Service, the culture that exists, if you haven't worked your way up through that organization, you're not going to know whose advice to listen to. You're going to be given a lot of contradictory advice from police officials, some of them with less than the best intentions and agendas, and you won't know how to assess that evidence, that information they're providing. So that's part of the problem. That said, the Hawks were therefore subject to manipulation, interference by this police chief and other people, such as the Minister of Police, and allegations towards that effect have already been made with regard to the crime intelligence head, Richard Mdluli, facing very serious allegations and charges, and all this being moved or halted and prevented because of direct interference, allegedly, from the Minister of Police. So the Constitutional Court said, well, you can't fight corruption if the corruption agency is not able to act independently. So an amendment bill was passed, was introduced by the Minister of Police to Parliament, and was completely and wholly inadequate. Fortunately for us, we have a good portfolio committee of police. Certainly the chairperson and most of the members of that committee were quite thorough and rigorous, and they spent a few days a week listening to various submissions, about 21 submissions, 20 of which said that this current legislation was completely inadequate. The Minister of Police clearly didn't want to improve this independence of the Hawks, given what was presented to Parliament, and they made a whole lot of changes. They affected really quite wide-ranging changes to make sure that the person appointed is more independent, that the terms of reference of their jobs, the remuneration is protected, and that kind of thing, and that there would be no limited scope for interference. Unfortunately, it really does, at the end of the day, matter who is appointed to that structure. And that's where they didn't adhere to some of the recommendations. A lot of the recommendations are saying the person who heads the Hawks mustn't be purely appointed by the minister, because the minister could appoint a member of parliament, a member of their own party, a family member. There's nothing constraining the minister, apart from that the person must, consideration must be given now to integrity and to experience. So that's a good development. What we're arguing for is the same way you appoint judges, because of the important role that judges play in any country. You have an independent panel of experts. In this case, it would be people who understand policing, understand management, understand issues around corruption and integrity. They would form an independent panel. They could be appointed by the Portfolio Committee, for instance, and they would interview nominations and people applied for that position. They would then give a short list of, say, 3 names to the Minister of Police. The Minister of Police could then choose one of those people. That process, if it's transparent and open and public, means that you don't appoint somebody there who later you find isn't able to do the job, such as the case with Beketsele, or is corrupt, such as the case with Jackie Selebi. You prevent that from happening. Unfortunately, those kind of recommendations were not adhered to. So at the moment, it is, as an organisation, far more independent than it was previously, and it might meet the strict definition of what the constitutional recommendations were. But however, at the end of the day, it really does depend on whether the person heading that agency is willing to be completely independent, only act in terms of the constitution, the law and the facts, and not be swayed by political considerations. Until we know who the person is, we can't say much more about that.